Charles from GMAT Ninja Tutoring here. Welcome to our MBA Spotlight panel on 5 different things you can do to absolutely kill your GMAT score. Here with 3 of my very, very favorite experts in the GMAT world. Jeff Miller, COO of Target Test Prep, Rida Shafiq, strategy team head over at eGMAT, Chris Gentry, longtime senior GMAT instructor over at Manhattan Prep. All right, let's jump in. Rida, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to pick on you first. So can you give us your number one biggest thing that you see students do that absolutely destroy their GMAT score?
I think it's prematurely, thanks, Jeff, and hi, everyone. But I think it's really first that people just tend to focus on their timing way too early in their prep. They worry about, oh, I can't answer a CR question in 2 minutes. I can't answer this quant question, 800 level quant question in 2 minutes. But they haven't even spent the time on really getting those foundations right and understanding what kind of process and what kind of concepts they need to know. They worry about riding a mountain bike before they can even go on a tricycle, really. So I think that's something that kills people, and then it really demotivates them as well. So it's a cascading effect.
I love it. Chris, let me get to you next. If you had to pick on one thing that you see students do that you really wish they'd stop, what is it?
Well, by definition, the thing that lowers your score is getting the lower rated question. So ultimately, the question is always going to be, what's making me miss those lower rated? Now, I agree with Rita that trying to master time management at the beginning will oftentimes frustrate people. At the end of the day, one of the most common things that will crush people's scores is actually the time management in the test itself. So at some point, you will need to get to that element. In fact, I've seen score reports of students who timed out on the last 2 questions of a section, and the score drop in the subscore there was substantial. So that's the one that is most commonly seen as, oh my God, why did my score drop so heavily from what I was expecting? What killed my score from what I was expecting to get? The one that is underrated is the ability to fall for trap answer choices, especially in that time situation, the pressure and anxiety of the real test. And so what I see people unfortunately not do often enough is, even if you get a question correct, what were the traps and the answer choices? What were the test writers hoping you were going to fall for? And if you can prepare yourself for that in advance, that can help prevent that on test day too.
I love it. And Chris, just to be really clear, so you mentioned timing out at the end of the test and that really killing your score. So say a little bit more about that in terms of, so this is something that, we're getting a little bit deeper into the era of the new GMAT. What we're seeing is scores getting hit really, really hard. If you fail to answer 1 or 2 questions, your score drops enormously. I think what we've been seeing, Chris, let me know if this matches what you've been saying. If you omit a question at the end, it seems to cost you somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 or 4 points on that section. Chris, does that kind of match? Yep, on that subscore. Yep. So that makes the time management issue absolutely huge. And obviously, to Rita's point, if you hop into that too quickly, it can cause you trouble. And again, we're getting lots of questions already about time management. We'll circle back to those in a minute. Let me go to Jeff. If you had to pick on just one thing, what's the one thing you'd like test takers not to do?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of different ways you could go with this. One could be when you're building yourself up before the test. There's a lot of in-test things. Chris pointed at one really important one about making sure you don't leave any answers blank. But just as far as your prep in general, I think, a lot of people, when they dive into their studying, they just feel like, all right, I'm going to do thousands of random questions and I'm going to build my skills based on what I'm getting wrong and looking at answer choices. And like, I can't tell you how many times a day I say the words topical studying and how important that is, because the GMAT, what makes it really difficult is not necessarily the content. It can be, but it's the fact that you have to learn an insane amount of stuff and you're tested on so little of that. So you can't say, well, I know, 50% of exponents and roots, because if you get tested on the other 50% that you don't know, you're going to get crushed. And you can rinse and repeat that with all of the quant, verbal, and DI topics on the test. So you have to take a very meticulous approach to your studying. You need to make sure that you're mastering each topic one by one. It doesn't mean you won't eventually do mixed sets and do things more similar to what you'll be doing on test day. But initially, during your preparation, focus on a topic, master it, continue down the line with quant, verbal, and DI, and that way you'll know you're as rock solid as you can get walking into that test.
If I may add on to that, Jeff, you mentioned like the person who wants to do so many problems at once and just do all of the problems. One of my saddest stories is a tutoring student who we sat down for a session and he said, Chris, I'm so pumped for this session. I just did 75 critical reasoning questions. Let's go. And I had to pause for a moment to figure out how to ask him this. So I just asked him, okay, what do you remember of those 75 questions? And the look on his face as he realized he didn't remember anything. It was all just a blur to him.
Right.
Which section should we start the GMAT with? The one we're best with or the weakest one? Rida, is there anything you'd like to add to that one, just as far as like what you're advising students as far as their starting point?
No, I agree with Jeff that starting with either quant or verbal makes the most sense. One, because the reading strategies that you really perfect in both CR and RC, how you really read, along with some of the concepts that you learn in quant, make learning in DI a lot more efficient overall. I would say that for people who are starting out, who, often are discouraged by their starting scores, like Jeff said, it's one data point and it's one on the large scale, a minuscule data point. So take that as just step 0. I recommend that we start with verbal or with quant. It's best to push that to a logical conclusion before moving forward, especially if you're someone who has a really large barrier to overcome. If you're looking at a 200, 250 point, 150 point improvement, it's best to take verbal up to a certain level of excellence so that then you can work on improvements and refinements later on as you work on your alternate subsection. So I think that's the approach that people should really take. And then, like Jeff said, keep DI for the last phase of your preparation.
Excellent. I think it's time to jump into the time management because we're getting tons and tons of questions on it. And Chris, since you mentioned this as one of your biggest things that are score killers for your students is the time mismanagement. Rida, you also brought it up as time pressure too soon can cause trouble. And I think both of those things are spot on. So what should we have students do? So what strategy can you recommend for effectively managing time, especially in that data insights section? What are your recommendations? When do you start introducing time pressure into your practice? And Chris, we'll start with you on this one.
So when do you start introducing time pressure into your practice is a difficult question, but I would say that you want to start with a practice test almost immediately because you have to know what the time pressure is going to feel like. And then I would actually recommend that you practice sort of interleaving timed sets with untimed sets and untimed review as you begin studying. So do like maybe one day where it's completely untimed, one day where it's a short session of timed questions. And as you're working on the time sets, you can actually start to gradually increase the pressure. So let's say you want to average 2.5 minutes per question. And don't start with that time frame. Start with 4 or 5 minutes per question. And the next time set, dial it back to 4 minutes, then dial it back to 3.5 minutes, then to 2.5 minutes. And you can start to sort of gradually increase the time pressure and make your time sets more like the actual time frame of the test. Now, as for what causes timing issues on the test, it's about, for me more than anything else, know when to not work on a problem. The question was specific to DI section. One of the things that I've noticed in DI questions, especially in the DI questions that have multiple elements, it's very common that you'll have a DI question where one of the elements is very direct and you're like, oh, I know the answer to that. And you look at the next element and you're like, ouch, that feels like that's going to take me 10 minutes to answer. Don't do that other part. Don't do that other part. Just make your guess, mark it, maybe you have time to come back to it, move on to another question. You just don't see people moving on from the questions when they should. If you can get used to that, you'll feel better about the time management.
And Jeff, just add a little bit to what you're saying, because I think you're spot on. You can think of time issues as having two components. One is maybe you're not fast enough or not efficient enough in how you do questions fundamentally. So I think what you're suggesting, Jeff, is that over time as you practice, as you get better at quant verbal data insights, you're just going to be faster. You're going to get to more questions. The second component is time management that might have a strategy element where you go, well, hey, wait a minute. I don't know, maybe I need 55 minutes or an hour to comfortably get through all the questions on a section. And if that's the case, I have to pick my battles. And I think and somebody please jump in if you disagree, and any of you three, I think what we've been seeing from students, at least on our end at GMAT Ninja, is most students struggle timing-wise on data insights. And there's exceptions. I mean, you get some people who are really quick, but there's so much extra information if you get too, I don't know, too anal with it, and you're getting a little bit too focused and you're trying to read everything and be really great at it, you're going to have a hard time finishing up comfortably in 45 minutes. Almost everybody, yes, there are exceptions, struggles. And at that point, yeah, even if you're pretty fast, you might be good enough to get to 16 or 17 or 18 questions comfortably. And that's fantastic. You're still going to have to let some stuff go and go, hey, I'm not real sure on this, and I'm going to mark something and move on. But my point here is that I think there's, on one hand, don't confuse time management with speed. Getting better makes you more efficient, makes you faster. When we talk about time management, I think we mean picking your battles carefully. And by the way, almost everybody's going to feel like they're suffering on data insights early on. And if any of you guys are seeing something different, please jump in. I'm seeing Rida nodding on that. I think that's been an almost universal experience of it's rough. I'm going to hop over to a slightly different topic. I think this is relevant. Just how many practice tests should we take? I think a couple of you have kind of mentioned, Chris in particular, taking a practice test early on to get a sense of where you stand. One of the score killers I think we see is people who use the practice test badly. They do a ton of practice tests early on. That is their practice resource. And I'm not sure that it's a great way to get better. I guess, would any of you like to weigh in on kind of how best to use practice tests, how many to take, but how best to use them? And
in terms of building a schedule, work back from your test date. Figure out when you want to take the test for the first time. In an ideal world, you want to have 3 weekly practice tests in the 3 weeks leading up to that first practice test date. And then from those 3 weekly practice tests, what you would best be served is having your practice test about 3 weeks before that, and then about 4 weeks before that, and then about 6 weeks before that. So you're looking at about, take a first practice test at the beginning, a practice test 6 weeks later, a practice test 3 weeks later, and then about 2 to 3 weeks after that third practice test, get to a weekly cycle of practice tests leading up to an official test date. Now that is assuming that you have a particular time frame in mind. If you don't have a time frame in mind yet, set one. Go ahead and establish a goal date for when you want to take the test and work your practice test schedule back from that.
Jeff?
Yeah, so I think we all agree on, you need to take a practice test early on to get your baseline. Maybe a week in, it can be pretty darn cold because it's just a starting point. A lot of people are scared of it. Oh, it's going to affect me mentally. And it's like, well, no, I mean, if you're trying to beat your record for running a 5K, like you're going to run the 5K and see where you're at and then work your way up. I mean, there's a million analogies in life that you can compare to this. As far as what to do later on with your practice tests, I like students to save them until they've more or less completed the preparation. I know people do want to get those sneak peeks and say, well, is stuff sticking? But the problem with that is you can go in and take a practice test. If you're 50% done with the material, it doesn't mean you're going to see 50% of that material on the test, because that's not how these tests work. So what could ultimately happen is you can take that test, see very little almost of what you've seen, or maybe 25% of what you've studied, and then walk away from that test being like, man, I hate this GMAT. I don't want to keep studying for it. Why would I? Like, I'm not improving. And that's never good for your psyche. And it's just plain not necessary. It takes a lot of time and effort also to take those practice tests. So, my opinion is always to save them towards the end of your prep. I do agree, though, you do need a schedule and you need to know when you're taking your GMAT. And it's not to say that things can't be shifted. Life happens. Maybe it takes longer to get through your GMAT prep or even shorter, and you can move things up. But yeah, ideally save them to the end. And always remember too, don't waste them, because then you don't want to be that student coming back and saying, well, what other practice test should I take? There's really none other ones that we would recommend at this point. And you can also repeat the MBA.com one. So you have more practice tests now with GMAT Focus than you had with Classic GMAT. And if you're blasting through, let's call it 12 tests, and you run out and you're still studying for the GMAT, like you've done something wrong. So yeah, don't fly through those, get your prep done, and then get a schedule where you can effectively take those leading into to test day.
Really, really interesting question, kind of related to everything we're saying about practice tests here. When we talk about score killers, one of the things that I don't think has come up for us yet is just burnout, overdoing it, not taking care of your body. And again, I'm extrapolating a little bit here. about exhaustion in general, and some of these factors might not be an issue for this particular individual. I feel like if I spend 2 hours every day working on official GMAT questions, exhausted, and then full-length practice tests on Saturday, best strategies here. And I guess whoever wants to tackle this first, love to broaden this out to just how do you stay fresh? Because one of the biggest things we see, and Jeff, will start with you on this, one of the biggest things we see from our students is sometimes they show up, they've already put in 1,000 hours of studying before they even hire us for tutoring, and they try to sit down and do anything related to the GMAT, and their brain is just cooked. So Jeff, I guess how do you address that, and what's the best strategies for staying fresh and managing a schedule well?
Yeah, well, that question was an interesting one because I actually recently made a video. It's called "Don't Be a Weekend Test Taker," practice test taker, meaning don't take a test every Saturday. So that's the jumping in point. Don't be that student. It is going to burn you out. You don't need to. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about saving your tests. As far as scheduling and managing burnout, I mean, the first thing is it's a pain in the butt to study for the GMAT. Like it's not all rainbows and butterflies. You're going to have to put in time. Chances are you're a working professional. You might have a family. Even if you're in college, you're dealing with your college, academics and possibly extracurriculars. So it's going to be a grind, but you do need to be strategic, and you need to literally sit down and you need to map out your schedule. For example, when I was studying for the GMAT many years ago, I got up in the morning and I got to work early because I was able to do stuff at work. They knew I was studying for it, and I did it before everyone came to the office, and I got my studying done in the morning, and then I didn't have to worry about it at night after a long day at work, or if there were other stressors happening. And then, I had to commit to doing weekend studying where I would probably rather be doing other things. But I had to put in that time. And it doesn't mean you can't continue to do some of those things. I mean, you should reward yourself if you're putting in a good week's worth of studying, but getting a personalized schedule, not something that works for your coworker or your friend, like something that will work really well for you and fit into your life while pushing the stuff aside temporarily that doesn't need to continue to happen. All of that should allow you to efficiently get to your goal and help manage burnout and just trust your body. Like if, you're on a 6-day GMAT bender and you're like, wow, I'm just totally fried. Like, yeah, give yourself the day off and then come back stronger the next day.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important to, take care of your physical health. Don't put your GMAT prep schedules according to how other people did their GMAT prep schedules. But also, I think it's important to find someone in your life that you trust who's just nowhere related to the GMAT at all. I find a lot of GMAT students get so tunnel visioned about their GMAT prep, and they're like, my colleague did it in 2 months and he got it to a 735 and I'm just stuck here in the 600s, But it's very difficult to see the forest for the trees if you're constantly in that zone. So I think taking a step back, really evaluating yourself, and then talking to someone who's just not related to this at all just helps put the rest of your life also back in focus, and it doesn't lead you down this tunnel of despair. I think it's also important when you think about burnout, often it's also because people are just thinking of these huge goals that they have in mind, that I have to get from a 500 to a 700. And when you measure every single thing that you do against that 700 goal, every small step you take just feels like a drop in the ocean, like it's not making any impact at all. But when you set smaller and more manageable goals, when you can kind of make wins for yourself, I think that also that reward system really helps people just push a little bit harder. But push to shove, you have to give yourself that time mentally, physically, emotionally to come back stronger for your GMAT prep every week. So that's something.
I love it. But I guess my question really is, I think the score killer is sometimes letting there be too much calendar pressure too early and letting the test date kind of freak you out, dictate your studies. And so for somebody who says, hey, I need to gain 100 points, I only have 2 months to do it, or I need to gain 150 points, I've got this huge mountain to climb, I have a limited amount of time. What's your advice to them? How do you get people to sort of think differently maybe about their timeline or how far they can go and in what period of time? And any of you feel free to toss your mic on. I think I see Chris's brain working if you want to jump in.
Yeah, Chris, you can go first. I see you're excited about this one.
A little bit, because I've worked with a lot of students who have some pretty significant forms of test anxiety. And so a lot of this should be funneled into a discussion of, is my schedule causing me anxiety, or is my schedule feeling like a challenge? And those can be two very different mindsets. And this will be a very individualistic response as to what feels better for you. To have a more nebulous test date versus looking at this and saying, if I don't set a test date, I'm not going to feel like I have a target in mind. It's going to feel too loose, and I won't ever get it done. So there are two various extremes to that. If you are a person who has a lot of anxiety about the test, then in fact, it might be best for you to work without a test date in mind and to say, all right, I have a particular goal for this week. I have a goal for the next week. I have a goal for the week after that. That's all I have. I have 3 weeks worth of goals. And it doesn't have to lead to this particular test date, but I want to make progress on those 3 goals. Whereas I work with some people all the time who say, listen, I just knew that if I didn't set a test date, I wasn't going to feel accountable, and I wasn't going to feel like I actually had a deadline. And some people are charged by that. And so you have to do a little bit of self-assessment to figure out which approach resonates more with you. And again, thank you for letting me jump onto that, because it's, again, with the people I've worked with who have significant anxiety, it's something I feel really strongly about.
All right, we're running out of time here a little bit. And I realized that the title of this panel was 5 Things That Kill Our GMAT Score. And Zena, great question. What are the 5 things? We haven't really structured it this way. So what I'd like to wrap up real quick is I'd like to kind of give you both one quick sentence, tell you what your one thing is you'd add to the list. 2 that I think we're agreeing on pretty wholeheartedly here. One is not keeping your life balanced. If you don't do that, it can be really, really hard to study effectively and learn effectively. Second might be ignoring test anxiety. Chris, I think you and I are both I think all 4 of us are probably really passionate about that. And it's really easy not to think about that. So those are 2 big score killers: failing to keep your life balanced, letting yourself get burnt out, and ignoring anxiety and not addressing that adequately. I guess, Jeff, do you want to jump in with give me one sentence on one thing you'd add to that list?
I think that one of the big things to add would be, if we're talking going back to GMAT score killers, one of the things I wanted to say earlier, gaming the test is killer.
Ooh, good one, Jeff.
I have students, I'll say it really quick because I know it's supposed to be one sentence. They say, well, if I do this at the beginning and then rush at the end, I should be able to get my score. Or how many questions can I get wrong for score X? And I say, well, if I tell you that, what does that mean? Like, you know, in real time on the GMAT, how many questions you're getting right and wrong. And then you can consciously say, well, I'm going to get this question wrong and that question right. Because if you can, you're way better at the GMAT than I am or anyone else I know. So you don't really need my advice at that point.
Yeah, I love it, Jeff. Don't game the test. Chris, what's your one thing you'd add to the list?
Looking at a question saying, yes, I know exactly what to do. I'm going to do this one really, really fast so I have time for all the other harder questions. And you're like, I just made a careless mistake and I never noticed it. The more you look at a question, think, sweet, this is fantastic. I love this type of question. That's the more when you dial in and say, I'm going to do it right. I'm not going to be slow. I'm not going to waste time, but I'm going to do this right. And I'm not going to try and rush through it.
Great one. I love it. And Rida?
I think at this point ties into a lot of the other 4 points that we've said, is just not setting the right kind of goals for yourself throughout your prep, whether that be the metrics that you're reaching, the timelines that you set, or the targets that you set for each of your subsections or anything else. If you don't set the right metrics, and that starts with the right starting score, right target score, and so on and so forth, if you don't have those metrics set out, you're just wandering endlessly and doing questions and going to classes, but you're not learning anything, you're not taking tangible steps. So I think that's important.
I love it. All 3 of you, thank you so much for this. This is awesome. Rida, we'd love to have you join us for more of these panels. Absolutely fantastic. Everybody, Rida Shafiq, Head of Strategy at eGMAT. She's so great at this stuff. If she pats you on the back, you would put it on your resume. Jeff Miller, Chief Operations Officer, Target Test Prep. You know how like little kids, my 3-year-old wears Superman pajamas? Well, Superman wears pajamas with Jeff's logo on it. That's how great he is. Chris Gentry, senior, I've maybe had a little something to drink this morning, just kidding. Chris Gentry, senior GMAT instructor at Manhattan Prep. This guy's such a great teacher. He once taught a German Shepherd how to bark in Spanish. Terrible jokes. That's it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you at the next couple of panels: score stagnation, career advice, and data insights. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.